For centuries, the image was clear. Tall, fair-skinned warriors emerging from the cold northern seas, blonde hair beneath iron helmets, blue eyes scanning foreign coastlines. The Vikings, history told us, were a people defined by their Scandinavian blood, a distinct, almost mythological race forged in the ice and fjords of the far north. It was a story built over centuries of archaeology, legend, and literature, and it felt settled, permanent, true. Then scientists began extracting DNA from ancient burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the far corners of the Viking world. And what came back from the laboratory was not the story anyone expected. This was not a simple confirmation. It was a disruption. One that forced researchers to ask whether everything we thought we understood about the Vikings, their origins, their appearance, their identity had been built on a foundation that was far less solid than it looked. The conventional story of the Vikings begins around the late 8th century, in the coastal regions of what is now Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. These were Norse-speaking peoples, organized into clans and chiefdoms, who began raiding the shores of Britain and Europe, starting with the notorious attack on Lindisfarne in 793 CE. Over the following 3 centuries, they expanded with extraordinary ambition, settling Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, establishing trade routes from Scandinavia deep into Eastern Europe and Central Asia, founding the city that would become Kiev, and integrating themselves into the political fabric of England, France, and the Mediterranean. Historians and archaeologists understood them primarily as a Scandinavian people, a Northern European group with shared language, shared mythology, shared material culture. The genetic picture, most assumed, would look roughly the same, a fairly homogeneous population rooted in the ancient peoples of Northern Europe. But even before the DNA arrived, there were cracks in that picture. Burial sites across Scandinavia contained grave goods that didn't quite fit a purely local origin. Objects from the Middle East, Central Asia, and the British Isles appeared alongside Norse artifacts, suggesting contact far deeper and more intimate than simple trade. Some skeletal remains showed features that anthropologists found difficult to place neatly within a Northern European profile. Linguistic analysis revealed that Old Norse itself carried traces of contact with languages from unexpected directions. Then there were the sagas. Read carefully. The Old Norse sagas describe a world far more ethnically complex than the popular image allowed. People of different origins appear in these stories not as outsiders, but as participants. Warriors, merchants, slaves, and settlers who traveled with, fought alongside, and sometimes married into Norse communities. The literary record hinted at a world the simple ethnic portrait had flattened. These anomalies were noted, but they were explained away as evidence of trade, conquest, or incidental contact. No one was ready to say that the Viking identity itself was more complicated than the map suggested. That changed when the genomic analysis began in earnest. Over the past decade, advances in ancient DNA extraction have allowed researchers to sequence the full genomes of individuals who died more than 1,000 years ago. The technique is painstaking, DNA degrades over time, and ancient samples are often fragmentary. But with improved laboratory methods and ever larger comparison databases, scientists can now read genetic signals from Viking Age remains with remarkable precision. What makes this kind of analysis so powerful is its depth. Mitochondrial DNA, passed exclusively through the maternal line, can trace ancestry back through a direct female lineage across thousands of years. Y chromosome analysis does the same for the paternal line. And autosomal DNA inherited from both parents in roughly equal measure provides a comprehensive picture of ancestry across all lines simultaneously. Together, these tools allow researchers to identify not just where a person's ancestors came from, but when different ancestry streams entered the family tree, and in what proportions. When this toolset was applied to Viking Age skeletal remains across more than 20 sites in Scandinavia and the broader Viking world, the results were not what the standard story predicted. If you've been following our channel, you already know that human history almost never turns out to be simple. Subscribe now, because this story is about to get significantly more complicated. The first major surprise was diversity within Scandinavia itself. Researchers expected to find a relatively uniform genetic profile among Viking Age individuals in Scandinavia, a population shaped primarily by the ancient hunter-gatherers who had lived in the region for thousands of years, mixed with Neolithic farmers who arrived from the south thousands of years before the Viking Age began. What they found instead was far more variation than that model predicted. Individuals buried with classic Viking grave goods, the swords, the longboats, the runes, carried ancestry from multiple different streams in proportions that varied significantly from site to site. Some individuals showed substantial ancestry from populations associated with the ancient steppes of Central Asia, the descendants of Bronze Age pastoralists who had swept westward across Eurasia thousands of years earlier. Others showed elevated ancestry from populations associated with the ancient farmers of southern Europe and the Near East. The degree of variation within Scandinavia itself was striking. One burial ground in Sweden might show a genetic profile noticeably different from another just a few hundred kilometers away. This does not mean the population was not Scandinavian, but it does mean that even within Scandinavia, the Viking Age was not genetically homogeneous. And that variation was telling a story about the deeper history of the region, layers of ancient migration and mixing that predated the Viking Age by millennia. But the finding that genuinely complicated the portrait came from what lay outside Scandinavia. When researchers analyzed the genomes of individuals buried at Viking Age sites in the British Isles, Ireland, Iceland, and continental Europe, people who showed clear evidence of Norse cultural identity through burial practices and archaeological context, they found something unexpected buried in the genomic signal. Several individuals at sites associated with Viking settlement showed substantial ancestry from populations that had no expected connection to Scandinavia at all. One analysis, drawing on remains from across Britain and Ireland, identified individuals with Pictish ancestry, Celtic ancestry, and Slavic ancestry buried alongside Norse individuals not simply as conquered locals, but integrated into communities in ways the genetics suggested involved intermarriage and shared domestic life across multiple generations. Iceland, long assumed to have been settled almost exclusively by Norse colonizers from Norway, showed a strong and early signal of ancestry from the British Isles, so strong that researchers concluded it was not incidental, it was structural. The founding population of Iceland was demonstrably mixed from its earliest days. Then there was the question of appearance. The image of the blonde, blue-eyed Viking is so embedded in popular culture that it functions as fact. But the genomic evidence suggests it was always a partial truth at best. Researchers can now reconstruct pigmentation traits, hair color, eye color, skin tone from ancient DNA with reasonable accuracy. And what the Viking Age genomes show is that the population was meaningfully more diverse in appearance than the popular image allows. Dark hair was common, brown eyes were far from rare. The genetic variants associated with lighter pigmentation, though present in Scandinavia, were not universal, and in some burial populations they were actually less common than in modern Scandinavians, suggesting that some of the pigmentation patterns we associate with Northern Europe today intensified after the Viking Age rather than before it. At this point, there are three broad explanatory frameworks researchers have proposed, and the evidence does not yet allow a clean choice between them. The first is what might be called the integration model. Under this framework, the Vikings were always a culturally defined identity more than an ethnic one. Groups of different ancestry adopted Norse culture, Norse language, Norse religion, and were accepted as part of the community. The genetic diversity in the burial record reflects the reality that Viking identity was a kind of cultural citizenship, open in practice to people of multiple origins. The second is the mobile contact model. Under this framework, the extraordinary geographic range of Viking activity from North America to the rivers of Russia meant that Norse populations were constantly coming into contact with and incorporating members of radically different communities. Slaves taken from the British Isles and Ireland, merchants from Slavic territories, traders from the Arabic world, all of these groups left genetic traces in the populations that carried out and descended from Viking Age activity. The diversity in the DNA is not about Viking origins. It is about the consequence of Viking movement. The third is the deep ancestry model. Under this framework, the variation in Viking Age Scandinavia reflects something older, the genuine genetic heterogeneity of Scandinavia itself, which by the Iron Age already contained multiple deep ancestral streams from the ancient hunter-gatherers, the Neolithic farmers, and the Bronze Age steppe migrants who had arrived in successive waves over thousands of years. The Viking Age did not create the diversity. It simply expressed it. Each of these models has evidence in its favor. None of them alone accounts for everything the genome reveals. And the most intellectually honest reading of the current data is that all three may be partially true, that Viking genetic diversity was produced by ancient layering, amplified by cultural openness, and extended by the vast geographic reach of Norse activity. The landmark study that sharpened this debate appeared in Nature in 2020, led by researchers from the University of Copenhagen and involving collaborators across Europe and North America. It analyzed the genomes of more than 400 Viking Age individuals from burial sites across a wide geographic range. It was the largest ancient DNA study of the Viking world ever conducted at that time, and its findings have become the central reference point for this entire conversation. Among its most striking conclusions, a significant portion of the individuals identified archaeologically as Vikings showed no Scandinavian ancestry at all. They were locals, British, Irish, Slavic, who had been absorbed into Norse communities and were buried with all the markers of Viking cultural identity. The study also confirmed that the founding population of Iceland drew heavily from the British Isles, that genetic diversity within Scandinavia during the Viking Age was higher than previously modeled, and that the blonde, blue-eyed stereotype, while not entirely false, represented only a part of the actual variation present in the ancient population. The researchers were careful. They did not claim the Viking world was uniformly multicultural in any modern sense. They did not overstate what the genetics could prove about cultural identity or social inclusion, but they were clear on what the data showed. The genetic portrait of the Viking Age was meaningfully more complex than the conventional narrative had ever acknowledged. Here is the implication that tends to land hardest. The genetic findings do not diminish the Vikings. They do not shrink them or strip them of their history. What they do is reveal a different kind of greatness, not the greatness of a single unified people marching out of a frozen homeland, but the greatness of a cultural force powerful enough to absorb and integrate people from across the known world to create a shared identity that transcended blood and to leave a genetic signature scattered across continents in ways that are still being decoded 1,000 years later. That is a bigger story than the simple one, and it is, in the end, a more human one. Close your eyes for a moment, or rather, let the words do it, and imagine the harbor at Hedeby in the 9th century. Ships from a dozen different origins rocking at anchor. Men speaking Norse alongside Arabic, alongside Old English. A marketplace where Byzantine coins changed hands, where furs from the far north were traded for silk from Central Asia. The people moving through that space were not a single homogeneous race. They were a world in motion, gathered under a set of shared practices and beliefs and ambitions. And when they died, they were buried the same way, with the same rites, the same grave goods, the same identity. Their bones carried the evidence of everywhere they had been and everyone they had become. The genome did not erase that picture, it completed it. What scientists are still working to understand is the full extent of the layering, how many generations it took for certain ancestry streams to integrate, how much genetic structure remained within Scandinavian communities that appeared culturally unified, and what the downstream legacy of Viking Age mixing looks like in the modern populations of Iceland, Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia today. Those questions are still open, the data sets are growing, new burial sites are being excavated, new methods of ancient DNA extraction are being refined. What we know now is already enough to retire the simple version of the story. The Viking was never simply a Scandinavian. The Viking was a role, a culture, an identity built by people who came from many places and carried histories that their own myths did not fully record. The genome preserved what the sagas left out. It remembered what the historians simplified. And it points still, even now, toward a human past that is far older, far stranger, and far more interconnected than any of the old maps were ever large enough to hold. If you find yourself drawn to stories like this one, stories where the evidence arrives and quietly dismantles what we thought was settled, then subscribe. There are dozens of populations whose genomic histories are being rewritten right now, and almost none of them look the way the textbooks promised. The map of the human past is being redrawn, and the most surprising thing about it is not what has been found, it is how much is still waiting to be discovered. The Vikings were real, the raids were real, the ships, the settlements, the sagas, all real. But the people who built that world were not who the popular imagination decided they were. They were something more interesting, something more complicated, something that took 1,000 years and a revolution in molecular biology to begin to understand. The genome remembered, and now, slowly, so do we.